Welcome to Presentation 6, in the series where we're looking at the book of Leviticus. Before we start this part, let's just look back at the previous presentation. Built around uncleanness, the theme of chapters 11 to 15, and we saw that this was sandwiched between the chapters before, which relate to the sacrifices in the priesthood, and in particular the failure of the priesthood, Aaron's sons, and the Day of Atonement, the national day when things were put right before God. And it's got to be interpreted in its context, in the sequence of ideas. Also in the context of the society and the culture and the situation of the people at that time. We noted that this was a strange list. In the last presentation we dealt with clean and unclean foods. We're now going to move on to childbirth, skin and fungal diseases and sexual activity. But we've got to interpret this in the context of the culture and setting of that time. And this is not a rule book. It illustrates principles that underpin our understanding. So we're going to look at these three areas in this presentation. Looking for the principles, the things that can guide us today. God made everything, and He made everything good. It may have been messed up by us and by demonic activity, but God made everything and it was good. But His people were called to be different, to be marked out, and to be seen to be different. God's people are a visible expression that God is different. God is only seen through His people who have responded to Him. And His people should be different. And the food laws are part of that expression of difference. Yes, there's practical guidance for a people moving to a new environment from slavery to freedom. But it was a physical expression that this people were set apart for God, that they were to be different. They were to make God known to the people groups around. This was part of the visible reminders that as a nation, as a people, they had a destiny and a purpose. A purpose that was eventually fulfilled completely in the life of Jesus. So there are underpinning principles. The New Testament makes it very clear that food laws are no longer relevant. Israel as a nation is no longer the vehicle of God's grace because it had fulfilled its task, because from Israel came Jesus. And Jesus in Himself, personified Israel, has made God accessible to all humanity through His life, death and resurrection. That all who would want to come to God can now come to God through Him. But the followers of Jesus, we are called to be distinctive by lifestyle. There was distinctiveness for the people of Israel that started to develop in their desert journey. And the food laws are part of that. Today we have to work out how we are to be distinctive in what we do, what we don't do, how we behave, how we treat other people. Distinctive by lifestyle. And with that background, let's move forward into Leviticus 12. We read the passage, "The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. If she gives birth to a daughter, for 2 weeks the woman will be unclean as during her period. Then she must wait 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. When the days of her purification for a son or daughter are over, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or dove for a sin offering. He shall offer them before the Lord to make atonement for her. Then she will be ceremonially clean from her flow of blood. These are the regulations for the woman who gives birth to a boy or a girl. If she can't afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering, the other for a sin offering. In this way the priest will make atonement for her, and she will be clean. We need to remember we're talking about ceremonial uncleanness. Nothing to do with biology or hygiene. And we also have got to strip away our old ideas of the meaning of the word atonement. Atonement is a place where God and a human can meet. And that's all it refers to here. However, we've got to be honest. Read that passage and we're baffled. It looks utterly mysterious. What are we to make of these instructions? Now we must remember that we're talking about ceremonial uncleanness, nothing beyond that. It's access to the tabernacle area. We also have to remember that the knowledge of biology in those days and the support for a young mother, well, they didn't have what we have today. And there would be quite a time of recovery after birth. But it leaves us with puzzles. People could look at that and say there's a contradiction. It's a natural process. And why, oh why, are infant boys and girls treated differently? Well, we can look at this in a bit more detail. The first thing is that the childbirth itself is not involved. It is the natural discharges after the birth. In those days they would not have the facilities, the resources to clean up, to generate the afterbirth quickly, and to get the recovery. It just took time. But the uncleanness is ceremonial uncleanness. It's nothing to do with the birth being unclean or what happens being unclean after the birth. It's related to access to the tabernacle sacrificial system. And we have to remember that the emphasis in Leviticus is that the access to that system required perfection. And the young mother had been through a traumatic experience. It takes time to recover. But we simply don't know why sons and daughters are treated differently. There is no clear medical reason. So we just have to leave that aside. There must be some cultural factor, but we're not aware of it. We're back to this gradation. You're ceremonially unclean, in other words, access to the tabernacle sacrificial system. Natural causes. Childbirth was natural. But there are events that followed it that just take time to heal and restore. Because access to God through the tabernacle system, what it taught the people was perfection, because God is perfect, wholeness, completeness. And so in a sense this chapter is answering the question, what needs to be done after the childbirth before coming into the tabernacle. Time, washing, and the sacrifices were of a very small nature. Now let's move on to the second bit. This runs throughout Leviticus 13 and 14, and you may need to or want to read these chapters. Now the problem here is a problem related to understanding words. And the old Bible versions have really confused the issue considerably, simply because it wasn't known in the 16th century what the words meant. Now there's the word in the Hebrew, sarath. Now various Bible versions translate this, defiling skin disease, infectious skin disease, contagion of leprosy. Now, the top one is by far the best one. The other two are simply incorrect. They didn't understand the idea of infection in those days. And it certainly was not leprosy, because leprosy did not exist in that part of the world at that time. And the word doesn't mean that. The word literally means any kind of disease or malformation in the skin of anything, not just human skin. Anything that's on the surface that makes the thing not quite right. And it can be applied to skin, clothing, leather, wood, stone, a building. Anything on the surface that removes its perfection. So you'll find in chapters 13 and 14 it's applied to human skin, fabrics and leather, and even to building structures towards the end. Different words are used in our English translation, like mold or rot, but it's all the same word in the Hebrew. We're talking about something that's on the surface that can be seen that makes the thing not quite right. Now with that background in mind, we can see it's applied to human skin. And there are descriptions in chapter 13 and the rituals to be followed in chapter 14. It's applied to physical objects, descriptions in the latter part of 13 and the rituals to be followed the latter part of 14. Now we could in modern terms describe it that way. Anything on the skin, lesions, boils, ulcers, burns, sores, rashes, and even unnatural hair loss. Anything that's obvious that can be seen, which is a disfigurement, something has gone wrong. But equally, the same word could be applied to fabrics, leather, any kind of mold or rotting in buildings. It's the same word, and it's a principle, and it's nothing to do with leprosy. Leprosy was not curable, and yet the expectation throughout these chapters is that the thing is curable. Now the flaws that could be seen, they might or might not be serious, and people would be worried. There was no medical service, nothing. And the procedures that are described make complete sense. But the expectation was that it was temporary and not serious. And the rituals are described in the expectation of cure or cleansing. The person recovered. Then you'd go through the rituals, because only that which is perfect can have access to the temple, to the tabernacle, and to the sacrificial system. Now the role of the priests was central. They had to act to determine what was to happen. They were not medical. But they took the decisions. They guided people through that. And they decided that something was ceremonially unclean when they examined the skin of a person. That meant there was no access to the tabernacle, because only that which was perfect and seen to be perfect had access to the sacrificial system, reflecting God's perfect nature. And the practical situation was they set up a time delay, 7 days. See if it sorts itself out. Come back, have another inspection. And normally it did sort itself out. If it didn't, to put another 7 days on it. The expectation was that the person would naturally recover. And then when they recovered, they followed certain procedures, and they had full access to the tabernacle sacrificial system again. The whole thing has a message to it. God is holy. God is perfect. And there's a message behind the ceremonial uncleanness. Now this has to be seen in the context of how neighbouring societies saw skin diseases in particular. Sometimes it was linked to divine displeasure. It was obvious their God had passed judgment and given them this terrible skin disease, whatever it might be. Sometimes it was linked to the person having failed. They were guilty of something, done something wrong. Now there's a real danger in taking that. We follow that line, then it means that the person has fallen out of favour with their God because they've done something wrong. And if they've fallen out of their favour with God, then it's only right that they should fall out of favour with the other people. So they were isolated, repelled, rejected, pushed aside. That's the last thing someone who is ill actually needs. But it was based on the idea that their gods, or a specific God, could and would send disease. God doesn't do that. It's commonly held, even in Christian circles, that God can send disease, but it's a contradiction in terms. God is love. He has only the best for all his people all the time. Whatever disease may come from, it doesn't come from God. That's an impossibility, a logical impossibility. So the people with the skin diseases in the culture that was of this people coming out of Egypt, they were to go to the priest. And the priest would have a time delay put on it, rechecking with the expectation that there would be natural recovery. Nothing to do with spiritual healing, not in this case. So you can see where it fits against the cultures of the day, but there were also some cultures that looked upon any kind of disfigurement, permanent or temporary. It was a bad omen of something. They lived in a world of omens and magic. So it had to be interpreted. And it would be interpreted in terms of predicting future disasters or events, or avoiding future disasters or events. And again, the simple procedures that are laid out here in Leviticus contradict that as well. Look at it logically. Give it time to heal. Simple procedures to be followed. And the person is fully integrated back. Now, in the Egyptian culture from which they'd come, the treatment of disease involved kind of incantations. And it's closer to what we would now call magic, mumbo-jumbo. And again, the simple, logical procedures laid out here contradict all of that. So you can see there are clear messages in how to deal with skin diseases or any kind of mold or rot to fabrics or materials. Some of it is purely practical, to do with hygiene, but it breaks away and contradicts the practices of the people groups around, but it also points to the cleanness, holiness, set apartness of the tabernacle sacrificial system. Now the priests were central. Didn't matter whether it was a skin disease or material being damaged in some way. You can summarize it that way, and it was a simple, logical procedure. But the goal was regaining access to the tabernacle system. It was the same for materials. Either the problem solved itself, the mold was of no long-term significance, or damaged materials had to be stripped out. Like, for example, wet rot, dry rot, or a mold that had damaged a fabric. And again, it was a simple, logical procedure. Takes away all the magic. Sets the whole thing in terms of practicalities. But the underlying principle is that cleanness is the natural state of affairs, but access to God through the tabernacle sacrificial system was through holiness. Now there were things that were done outside the encampment of the people. The examination took place there. There's a ceremony with 2 live birds, symbolizing that the healed person was about to re-enter the community. Natural hygiene. Reintegration into society, but they stayed outside their home for a short period of time before being fully integrated. Simple, logical, common sense, but very different to the cultures round about. When that was gone through, then there were things that went on in the tabernacle, and it was the normal procedures of sacrifices. All these were now available. And they had the same essential meaning that was outlined in the first chapters of Leviticus. The person had access to the entire sacrificial system set up for the tabernacle area. Uncleanness had to be cleaned. Then the person had access, and the offerings opened up the way for access to God Himself. One little extra bit was put on, that blood and oil was smeared on the right-hand side of the person, ear, thumb and toe. Symbolism of some kind of healing, but we don't understand its significance. But that process completed the purification. The person was now totally restored. Restored to a full life in God's community, and restored to access to the tabernacle system. We have to remember the context of the words. Holiness involves many things, but one of them is wholeness, everything complete. Cleanness involves following the normal pattern. And in this case, it's speaking about things that were physically obvious because they were on the surface, which is what the Hebrew word refers to. Has to be cleaned up. And skin diseases or molds, they disfigure the surface of things. It's obvious. It undermines the principle of wholeness. It contradicts the normal order of things. Things are not quite right. They've got to be put right. And normally time did that. But we have to remember God's himself is absolutely perfect. The Lord of glory who made the universe. Ethically and morally perfect. Now that's very, very different from the gods of other nations. They were essentially just pictured as divine human beings who did good things and bad things. Yahweh, the God of the people of Israel, was very, very different. And only the perfect and holy could enjoy God's presence. And therefore there was a clear message. Anything that disfigured had to be kept away, outside the camp, away from the people, and away from the tabernacle. Now there's nothing mentioned about possible contagion, despite what some English translations say or imply. The idea of a contagion or infection was simply not understood in those days. And although the procedures make sense in terms of infection, the driving force behind it is ceremonial uncleanness, not potential infection. The fundamental principle is the nature of the concept of cleanness, not hygiene, not infection, although the procedures make sense in terms of infection. And after the person was healed, there was a ritual cleansing with water, and being made holy, being acceptable to God, was secured by sacrifice. And in this section, there is no connection of sin to the disease, the damage to a building or a fabric or a material. That is part and parcel of our human condition. However, skin diseases do seem to be regarded as symbolic. They're a symptom. Things are not quite right. Symbolic of the effects of human rebellion and its consequences. We rebel and we open the door to Satan and he messes us up. And God's creation is outwardly marred. It can be seen. Very often you can't see what's going on internally in the spiritual realm. But when we open the door through our rebellion, Satan can mess things up and mess us up. There are deep messages here for us. Now let's finally turn to chapter 15. Now this deals with sexual matters. And again we have to remember we're living at this time, and it's written in the context of a culture and a society which one didn't teach anything about it, but didn't really understand an awful lot about how the whole processes of sexual reproduction actually worked. So 2 to 15 verses of the chapter deal with a man who's unusual bodily discharge. Now in the original it doesn't actually have these words, unusual bodily discharge. It just has a discharge. They've been added in our English translation. Probably relates to a mild infection. Not a sexually transmitted disease, because in those days, without antibiotics, they were incurable. And the expectation here is always that the thing was temporary. Again, a time delay, ceremonial washing, and the minimum offering of sacrifice. It's a bit more precise in the Hebrew here, an emission of semen. Probably a night dream or some kind of premature ejaculation. Again, ceremonial washing, and everything was sorted out by the evening. These are natural things that happen. The next section looks at the women, the regular monthly menstruation. Give it 7 days, ceremonial washing, nothing else needs to be done. And finally, for the women, when there's any kind of bleeding outside the monthly menstrual period, and this possibly relates to miscarriage, once it's over, and the expectation it wouldn't last, give it 7 days to make sure it's cleared, and a minimal offering. Now there's practicalities of this. It makes a lot of common sense, but there are strange things about this as well. Four situations are described. I'm going to lay them out slightly differently. Some kind of male sexual illness that caused some kind of release through the penis of something when it shouldn't happen. Some kind of female sexual malfunction, possibly miscarriage. The expectation was clearance. Sort itself out. Ceremonial washing and a small sacrifice. We have to remember that in those days people did not understand, and both of these things would cause somebody considerable concern and worry. So there's a practicality. It takes away the worry. A little bit of time will all sort itself out. The other two situations are very much to do with the normal natural events related to sexuality. An emission of sperm when there shouldn't be a night dream or premature ejaculation during intercourse, and things to do with the female menstrual cycle. Natural events. They happen. Give it a bit of time, ceremonial washing, it's all over. Takes away the feeling of guilt. It also takes the feeling away of uncertainty, what's going on, to a people group where there was no medical advice. Again, we have to see this in terms of the neighbouring cultures. Now, in every culture, even today, when something appears to go wrong with the sexual function of a man or a woman, it's a matter of worry for that individual man or woman. Sex is such an important part of life, and it's a natural process, that the fear of being unable to perform properly sexually is a real worry, particularly for young people as their bodies are developing. And in those days there was no medical advice and little understanding of what was happening. But there's something much deeper here. Many of the surrounding cultures, sexual activity was associated with their temple worship. That was particularly true for the Canaanite people who were in the land that they were going to occupy. And immediately this chapter straight away lifts sexual activity up, places it where it should be as normal and natural, will sort itself out as the normal pattern of things, and detaches it completely from anything to do with the tabernacle rituals. Many cultures you went to the temple, if you were a man, and had sex with temple virgins, who very quickly were not virgins. Temple prostitution and fertility rites were associated with pleasing their God. That immediately is written out of the equation. But again, behind all of this, there is this emphasis that God's people are set apart. The concept of ceremonial cleanness. Things must be perfect. And when we go through the natural or sometimes not quite natural events of life, things are not quite perfect. Give it time. Things come right. Takes the stress and worry away. Everything is set in the context of involvement or entry to even. Everything to do with the sacrificial system of the tabernacle and the temple when it was built later. It all stresses holiness. And it makes a lot of sense. And normal sexual activity, there's no sacrifice involved. Ceremonial washing. It might be simply ceremonial or it might be hygienic. But they didn't understand hygiene then. But it's practical. Now it seems a bit harsh because menstruating women had a week that they couldn't access anything to do with the temple system. But life wasn't quite what it is today. First of all, women married very young. For very good practical reasons, so many infants died that women needed to have big families to have survivors. So women married very young. There was a long weaning process, which meant that her cycle and being able to be pregnant again were delayed. There was no contraception. So a married woman would just have child after child after child as a normal pattern. So there wouldn't be very many months of menstruation because large families were the norm. So we must judge this and look at this in the context of the culture and the time and the needs of the people who had no medical support and little understanding of what was going on. It's a strange world, this world of uncleanness, very foreign to Western thinking. And yet behind this are some very fundamental principles. The holiness of God. And we need to be clean to have any prospect of relationship with Him. These are things that at times we've forgotten. And because Jesus has opened the door for access to God our Heavenly Father, through all that He did in His life, death and resurrection, in many ways we have downplayed the frightening holiness, separateness of Almighty God of the universe, and our need to put ourselves right in every way to come into His presence. Holiness implies difference. When we come to God, we have to be set apart for God. There's a symbolism of perfection because God is perfect. We are declared acceptable to God. The New Testament word is justified or righteousness. We're declared that through all that Jesus has done for us. But we've got to remember the awesome holiness of God. And that which is normal, fulfilling God's divine purposes correctly. Fundamental principle underlying these chapters. But much of it is very practical. When things go wrong, which could be a natural process, could be an illness or disease, it could be a rot affecting clothes, give it time, ceremonial washing, and there was a sacrificial system, emphasizing the need to be clean to access a God who is holy. So behind this strange world of uncleanness are very deep and wonderful principles that go with us in life. But again, we've got to interpret this in terms of the context of a desert people escaping from slavery, not educated, and living in a society where the nations round about held very different ideas. So we've got to interpret it this way. And when we do, it begins to make sense. And it illustrates some very important fundamental principles. God, Yahweh, was the God of the Jewish people. The word means the self-existent one, but also the God of relationship. The tabernacle sacrificial system was central to make the point of the nature of God. God wanted relationship. Here was a mechanism for relationship. But that God was holy, ethically perfect, not like the gods of human inventions of the people groups around. Uncleanness was vital in approaching Yahweh. Now these are lessons that we, the people of God in the West today, we have got to relearn, recapture, and make central in our lifestyle and activities to make an impact on the world around. In the next presentation, we'll look at the Day of Atonement.